Hello, it's Steve, and this is Franky Four Hands, a deconstructed dungeon crawler roguelike where positioning and resource management is key. At least, that's the idea. It's still a prototype. So what's the concept? Well, I had recently watched Adam Saltzman's talk about his approach to making small games. For the planning of this prototype, I mainly stole the separation of ideas and formulas that he was talking about in that talk. I had been thinking about my past experiences playing Half-Life 1 and 2, barely making it through with whatever resources you have on the harder difficulties was, to me, a pretty unique experience I always tend to go back to. Another formula that I had been playing around with a long time was like a zombie SRPG concept where you'd gather, guns and equipment and make shields out of car doors and strategically move around maps and kill zombies, do that thing. Specifically this idea of like holding your own against overwhelming odds with good positioning, big shield in a tight hallway, holding off a whole horde of enemies was really satisfying to somewhere in my brain. So I was playing with these formulas in my head for a little while, and I extracted something that I can think of as the core ideas that I enjoyed about them. That was the resource management and the kind of limited space, limited options of that idea of the shield in the hallway. Further illuminating the limited space concept, it brought to mind like this maze with tight hallways, and for some reason I combined that idea with a limited control scheme, so just the forward movement directions. Mazes made me think dungeon crawler, so let's formulate these into a classic style dungeon crawler, but keep it as minimal as possible. I'm keeping the top-down, tile-based, turn-based sort of gameplay with bump-based combat. And that bumping in those four directions led me to the thought of 4 different equipment slots, one for each direction. And different equipment would come into play the different direction of the bump. And just to round it out, automatic item pickup so that I didn't have to deal with equipment screens and anything like that. So I swiftly got to the basic project layout I always start with. Here's a sketch of the general project architecture I like to go with. I'm going to talk about this in a different video, but feel free to pause and try to figure out what's even going on here if you want. I also did my basic bad setup for visuals. This is something I always do now at the beginning of the prototype, and I already have a video posted on how I get that set up. So check that out if that sounds interesting. With all that roughed in, I built a basic tile map system. I know Godot already has one, but for this prototype, I didn't really want to create any sprites, and my needs for the tile map system were actually pretty minimal, so I decided to just roll my own for the time being. After getting that in, I implemented a little simultaneous movement system inspired by, we'll just call them early dungeon crawlers. I don't have a direct frame of reference here. The way it works is when the player chooses a direction, they call out to a movement manager script, which churns through all the enemies and updates where they want to be going to at the same time. And with this, you can pre-calculate what the collisions are going to be since everything's moving at the same time. Added a set of event helpers for each of these different collision events, and it calls out to those during the time that they're needed. This is events helper class. Now, depending on how big of an OOP demon you have in your brain, these probably look pretty ugly. But to me, there's very little hidden complexity here, and the only thing that's happening is exactly what it says. Essentially, combat boils down to bumping an enemy. You'll always be able to defeat the enemy, and then the equipment you have in that slot dictates how much, if any, damage you end up taking in the interaction. Which brings us handily to the equipment system itself. I'll go over how each of the items in the game is supposed to work generally in the initial concept. The sword defeats enemies at or below its power threshold without the player taking any damage. So a 6 power sword would defeat any 6 or below enemy with no damage taken. The shield reduces the damage taken from an enemy based on the power threshold. A 3 power shield versus a 5 power enemy would result in the player taking 2 damage. And potion is pretty standard. It does nothing in combat, but if you bump against a wall in its given direction, it'll heal you based on its power. The food is pretty similar to the potion, but it also increases your maximum HP. They also added a runestone, which does nothing in combat, but increases the power of other non-runestone equipment So with a +1 rune and a +2 rune, a 1 power sword will become a 4 power sword, with the trade-off of having 2 of your directional slots taken up by non-combat equipment. Let's go through some of the major flaws of this system I found while I was working on it, and some of the workarounds I implemented in the prototype. I'm sure some of these issues are already screaming at you if you've been following along. Alright, problem the first. Since I'm limiting the power level of enemies to 1 to 9, a 9 power sword would effectively make you invincible in that direction. The same with a 9 power shield. The first simple solution I came up with here was to just add an absolute power cap on some of the equipment, like the sword and the shield. What I landed on was an 8 power sword being the absolute limit, and we'll say a 7 power limit for the shield. The other problem I was thinking of was the shield is basically just a more powerful version of the sword. The difference in a 7 power shield versus a 7 power sword, they do exactly the same thing on any enemy at or lower than 7, but then above 7, the sword becomes useless and the shield reduces its damage by 7. So, much better. The solution I came up with here was to add a degradation system to the shield, so it slowly becomes less useful as you use it. This results in a nice 3-way resource system between health, equipment slots, and now the shield health. It gives it just a little bit of room for the sword and shield to have different use cases. The next problem I ran into is that runes became kind of pointless later on, especially if you pick up a piece of equipment that's already at its max power level. The rune wouldn't do anything, so you just have a useless slot. Simple fix for that was just to add a secondary max spawned power to shields and swords. Shields I ended up setting to 6 and swords to 5. Now the only way to have the highest power version of a sword or a shield would be to also have 1 or more runes equipped. Next problem I ran into was figuring out how shield degradation would work with runes. Some questions I had to ask myself was, does a shield become broken when it reaches 0 power base? Or what happens when a shield's only held above 0 power because of a rune? The solution I came up with there was just to let the power level be negative. Anything at or less than 0 is quote-unquote a broken shield that basically does nothing. This had some weird kind of knock-on effects where a rune can actually regenerate a shield from its broken state. And also, if your shield happens to be above its maximum power when counting the rune, and then it's used, so therefore it degrades, the resulting power level may still be at or above its max, so the player wouldn't even see it degrade then. So it kind of feels a little inconsistent. I decided that was a problem for not the prototype and just moved on. The final problem we'll talk about here is basically just food. Getting a lot of max health combined with the fact that you can kind of skip enemies and speed through floors, which meant that you could outscale basically the whole game just by trying to skip as many enemies as you could and looking for food and runes, ideally, to buff your food. And this problem persisted even as I added the idea that although enemy scaling stops at floor 10, there'd be less items per floor after that point, literally down to 1 item per floor at some point. Still, this wasn't quite enough, so I also added an item rarity system. These are the values in the prototype. Basically, swords and shields are the most common, with runes and potions being a little less common, and then food itself being the least common. This gave me a knob to directly scale the amount of HP the player may gain per floor, which did make the game a bit harder, but it's still pretty easy to run away with the amount of health you can get. And this is a problem that has more at this point to do with the all or nothing design of combat and the fact that you can kind of skip enemies really easily. But I'll have to keep this in mind for eventual reworks of wherever this game goes. The implementation of this system had to support the idea of a bunch of different equipment with pretty unique interaction. This is the base equipment script. We'll just talk through each of these callbacks real quick, and I think how this all works will become pretty clear. On bump is like the workhorse function here. This is where combat and wall bumping logic live. Theoretically, we could break it out into on-bump wall and on-bump enemy. This is where we calculate how much damage gets done to the player in a combat or whether or not to use a usable item. On-modify equipment is currently just used for the rune. This just passes in a set of the currently equipped equipment and lets that script replace it with something else, so say a higher power value version in the case of the rune. On post bump, This was kind of pointless to add, as it's currently only used to degrade the shield after a enemy bump occurs. It would also be a pretty good place to just destroy equipment that is just used, like potions and food, rather than returning a flag on whether or not the piece of equipment is used up. So it's not a bad idea, it just wasn't implemented perfectly. There's also get text 1, get text 2, get max spawned power level, basically irrelevant for combat. Just things that are either used in the UI or in the item spawning system. Alright, with that all covered, the core gameplay loop was working more or less fine. The player has to kind of consider positioning with a weird extra interaction of having to move back and forth across items to pick them up in a certain way. I don't know if I like that interaction, but it's unique. I really don't miss the attack button here, and that's just really down to how elegant bump-based combat really can be. I don't really take any credit from that. I just stole that from older dungeon crawlers. And after messing with that for a while and deciding the gameplay loop was good enough for a prototype, I slapped a little high score system in that tracks the level you were able to get to and some basic settings and called it a playable prototype. So that leads naturally to our final question: what's next for Franky Four Hands? I really think the key area where decisions need to be made is what would be a better formulation of these ideas. The two primary directions I see this going are more towards a puzzle direction or more like a roguelike RPG direction. What makes the puzzle direction enticing is that the directional combat already feels a little puzzly, so really handcrafted levels would probably pair better with this combat mechanic. But also handcrafted levels are liable to be a bit of a time sink, so that's a consideration. Also, the uniqueness of the interaction system, the ability to add very specific interaction, is something that this prototype doesn't really fully leverage, but I think there's room for it. If we increase the complexity of this equipment interaction system just a bit, we could have a very, like almost an immersive sim style system that might benefit a puzzle-based game a little bit better. On the roguelike side, there was clearly some influence there on the way that the rune and the sword and shield interact, and those power combinations actually did feel pretty good, in my opinion. But of course, if this game went down this way, we'd have to add much more complex interactions, which would include a more complex stat system, and that would lead to a more complex UI, most likely. Yeah, whatever. But I think the power fantasy of a roguelike actually pairs pretty well with the weird body horror aspect of Franky having 4 hands. For both cases, more complexity is inevitable, obviously. If we ever move out of the prototype phase here, that's a given. I think either of these directions, higher resolution implementation is going to happen no matter what, which means thinking about a first draft of the art style soonish, and maybe a final version would likely switch to Godot's tile map implementation, so getting some tile map ideas out would also be good. And the item system is going to have to be reworked regardless. So I'd like to have another pass at that before I come back. So next moves here, I think I'm going to do 1 or 2 more prototypes before returning to this concept. I'd like to get my head around a better implementation of how stacking effects would work in this sort of a game. I've kind of needed to roll a new one of these for most prototypes I make because I really do like stacking systems, and I think it would really help to have a generic version of this that might be applicable with a little bit of tweaking to any number of games. The other thing would be a generic way to store scripts without having to maintain an enumeration set with all of them. I can't currently think of a way to do this that doesn't involve a dirty hack of some kind, so it might just be too much overhead in one way or another to even do this, but I want to give it a pass and see what I've come up with. I'll probably be making individual videos for each of these, so keep an eye out. And definitely check out the game on itch.io. It's fully playable right in the browser. And if you're feeling truly generous, tell me what you think. Are my reads on what the game succeeds at and does not succeed at correct or completely off base? I would be eternally grateful for the feedback. And as I said, keep your eyes on this space. More prototypes, more discussions to come in the near future. That's it for me. Peace.